Howdy folks, this is Dr. Science. Once again, we're taking a look at the second half of Chapter 8, where we'll be examining language and intelligence. Now, to get started, I've got a video here just looking at language in chimps and apes. It's a really interesting video, and there's a lot of things that we could say, but I'd like you to go ahead and give it a watch. See what you think about it, and we'll move on from there. I'll give you 3 seconds now to pause this video and watch that one. 3, 2, 1. Okay, so moving on from there, if I was to debrief that last video, I love the idea that language is the hallmark of intelligence, and that one of the qualifiers of whether or not someone has language is whether or not they're able to come up with original words. If you ask me, I don't think that I've seen any animals that actually can speak, that are actually intelligent enough to use speech. There are animals that can say words, there are animals that can use sign language, but mostly what they're doing is identifying patterns and responding to them almost automatically. You know, these animals are not necessarily coming up with original ideas. A lot of their sentences just kind of look like a jumble of words, especially as presented in this video. If I see a video of an animal that really seems like it's communicating, I would absolutely love to change my mind. This is something that I really thought made a lot of sense when I was younger, that animals could speak and they just had limited speech. But to be honest, I don't think that this is something that exists yet. That being said, I do remember learning about uh, um, a history of animals with speech, and how younger animals, children of animals that were learning speech, learn speech so much better. And so I believe that if we're going to impart language into chimps or apes, what we would have to do is get it through a series of several generations of animals. And not only would that be beneficial, but I think it would be beneficial to teach them by somehow making it necessary for them to speak. Like, they don't get to eat unless they properly vocalize. Um, that would be pretty unethical to do that sort of research, and very difficult and costly, so I don't know if it's ever going to happen, but there you go. Now let's go ahead and move on to look at a couple types of language problems. People who have difficulty in producing language or understanding language are folks who are said to have a type of aphasia. An aphasia is a language problem with speech or comprehension. Aphasias are usually caused by brain damage, most often from a stroke. So a lot of the folks that have aphasias are older adults who have had more likelihood for a stroke. Here we've got two types of aphasia presented, Broca's and Wernicke's aphasia. I'd like you to go ahead and watch these two videos. The first one presents Broca's and the second presents Wernicke's, and we'll come back as a debrief in a moment. So take 3 seconds to pause this one and watch those. 3, 2, 1. Okay. Weren't those videos interesting? I love the dramatic difference in the type of problem that these two people are having, and you can really tell what's going on. In Broca's aphasia, you have the first gentleman who is able to understand what you're saying to him, but is not really able to string together words very effectively. People who suffer from aphasias can regain their abilities of speech over time. There are videos of that on the internet. It's really interesting to see it happen. But people with Wernicke's aphasia are a slightly different type of aphasia. People with Wernicke's aphasia have trouble with language comprehension. So this second gentleman may not understand what you're saying to him, although it kind of feels as though things make sense to him. In addition, the second gentleman says a whole lot of stuff, even sometimes phrases that by themselves seem to make sense, but they don't in context. He's able to speak using the automaticity of his language, but he's not really able to understand what's going on. Contrarily, the first gentleman has lost the automaticity of his language, but he still retains the comprehension aspect of it. So this is one of those situations where understanding what automaticity is really helps you understand the differences between these types of aphasia. With Broca's aphasia, you've lost automaticity but retained comprehension. With Wernicke's aphasia, you retain automaticity but have lost comprehension. So it's a really interesting bit. Uh, it's a really interesting way to understand how the brain works by understanding people who have problematic brains. Now, what we've got here is a deeper look at the different types of aphasias, as well as the location of the brain damage associated with those aphasias. So Broca's aphasia, again, has to do with an inability to string together sentences. You can say that what Broca's aphasia folks suffer from is an inability to decide on what words they want to use. And so it makes sense that Broca's aphasia is associated with brain damage closer to the frontal lobe. Remember, the frontal lobe is where we make decisions and have a lot of our conscious processing happening. Alternatively, Wernicke's aphasia, for folks who can speak, but the things that they say don't really make sense and they don't really understand what people say, it has a lot more to do with having lost comprehension but not so much automaticity. And it makes sense that therefore their type of aphasia or brain damage would have more to do with the temporal lobe. So the area that has to do with decision making, the frontal lobe, totally fine. So these people look like they totally can convey emotion or a decision to speak, but they can't quite convey information in the speech that they have. Okay, I hope that information made sense. All you really need to know is Broca's and Wernicke's aphasia moving forward. But let's go ahead and go to a different topic, the differences between spoken and written language. I'd like to start this topic by presenting an interesting experiment. The English language, and many languages with it, have the problem that the words in their language were constructed to be spoken. What do I mean? Well, in this sentence, every single word can carry extra meaning to it if it has the stressor placed on it. Excuse me. So let me try this. Think about the meanings of each of the following sentences. I never said she stole my money. 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 And you can imagine even more complicated versions of this, such as, I never said she stole my money, a sentence that insinuates that someone else said that the person stole something different. By placing the stress of the sentence on a different word in the sentence, the meaning of the sentence changes completely. And our languages were developed to be spoken, really not to be written. Written language is an afterthought. So it makes sense that when you write language and when you speak it, you have to do it in completely different ways. This is why writing seems like such a difficult task for a lot of people, even though they speak a language just fine. Your ability to convey information without all of the non-verbal aspects of language can be impaired if you haven't really had that experience yet. And I did just say non-verbal. How could non-verbal language play a part in written language if written language is totally verbal? Well, bear in mind that a lot of non-verbality doesn't just come from your body stance and what your face looks like, but also your tone, the speed at which you speak, the context in your language, the order of the way you say things. There are so many bits of language that are non-verbal, but still have something to do with words. This is why spoken and written language are completely different. It makes sense that spoken language is a lot more contextually organized than the written language because there is little to no context available to written language. You just have what is actually written. Whereas in spoken language, who is saying it, where they're saying it from, the loudness and tone and their face and there's so many context bits to spoken language that we don't notice, but that do get noticed by us. You could say that people who are actors or lawyers or teachers or really anyone whose job it has to do with speaking must master the different ways in which language can express information beyond just choice of words. So let's get back and say some simple things about spoken versus verbal language. Verbal language uses fewer words because instead it's able to convey meaning through non-verbal language. When you transcribe language, say you text someone in the exact same way that you would speak to them, that's not going to work very well. If you've ever texted someone and had an argument, you'll notice that text-based arguments are always rough because it's hard to convey what you mean exactly in text. It's difficult to give a heartfelt sentiment or to convey disagreement, but accepting disagreement with written languages or through text. So if you ever need to have an argument, I'd really encourage you to do it verbally because so much of arguments is emotionality, and it's difficult for us to convey emotionality in writing. This is why being an author is considered such a high status. Writing is not easy. Not everyone does it. Okay, so all of that stuff was complicated and confusing, and I just said a lot of words, and maybe they didn't make a lot of sense, but I think you can definitely understand the things that I'm saying if I show you them instead of say them. Gosh, that's awkward. Well, this video does a wonderful job of presenting how much information can be communicated through words, but also not through words. I'd like to give you a moment to watch the video. It's only like 5 minutes long, and it's a wonderfully laid out TED Talk. It does a great job of showing you how to do a great TED Talk without actually having a great TED Talk available. There's very little content in this video, but at the same time, there's quite a bit of content. Gosh, that's getting confusing. I'll give you 3 seconds to pause this video and watch that one now. 3, 2, 1. Isn't that amazing? I think he does such a wonderful job of being a great locutioner, person who talks without having directly saying what he's trying to say. Another aspect of nonverbal communication can be seen in sign language, especially sign language interpreters for music shows. It's kind of weird to talk about sign language interpreters for music shows. So sorry, I was sneezing. It's kind of weird to talk about sign language interpreters for music shows, right? Because you'd think that deaf people or people with some sort of hearing impairment probably wouldn't want to uh, go to a music show, but they can still enjoy music in a couple of different ways, especially if they have some amount of hearing. They could hear maybe part of the music. In addition, people who are deaf can still feel vibrations. They can still see things, so they can still feel things going on, which is kind of exciting. And you can definitely tell that the emotion is being strongly conveyed by these sign language interpreters of music. There are some cases where the sign language interpreter takes on a almost stealing of the show because of how well they're able to convey the emotion that the music is auditorily conveying. Okay, in this last slide on nonverbal communication, I'd really like you to pay attention and watch this video. It does a great job of talking about the thing I was talking about earlier, how texts, arguments just can't convey a lot of the information that a conversation normally would be able to. And it shows how two different people can be on completely different wavelengths. So I'm going to give you 3 seconds now to pause this video and watch this one. I really, really hope you watch this one. It's super funny by Kay and Peele. So to give you, let's do that. 3, 2, 1, go. Okay. Did you watch the video? I hope you really did. I think it's a lot of fun. And the only debrief I'll give you is, have you ever had a conversation that was really important, but that just constantly you felt as though you weren't on the same page? Maybe an argument with a boyfriend or a girlfriend. These conversations can be rough because when you say something, they understand it one way, you understand it a different way, and together you are talking but not communicating very effectively. Those are such rough and difficult conversations, arguments to have, and they can be hurtful, painful, annoying, frustrating. Um, and there are, limitations to the way in which we speak, and even the best speakers sometimes struggle to convey what they're feeling, and even the best interpreters, listeners, sometimes understand things in the wrong way because we have our own contexts. Our minds work in different ways, and we're always going to perceive things just in our own way, which might not be the way that we were intended to perceive them. So if you ever have to apologize or are apologized to for conveying something incorrectly or for taking something incorrectly, be aware it's just part of the human condition, part of the imperfection of our language. Nonverbal communication has so many aspects to it, and it's never going to be perfect. Let's go ahead and move on to the last section in this chapter, intelligence. Intelligence is the ability to learn from experience, solve problems, and use knowledge to adapt to new situations. There are many ways that you could describe intelligence, but these are kind of the hallmarks that we use for intelligence generally. So I just said there are many ways to describe intelligence, so you do want to ask yourself, is there such a thing as multiple intelligences, or is there one single general intelligence? Well, we'll start with the idea of a general intelligence, the idea that people have an overall capacity or ability to understand and do everything that they do, and that everything about us has some aspect of general intelligence that affects it. General intelligence can be measured by intelligence tests such as IQ tests or working memory tests such as the O-span that we talked about before. Now, there are a lot of evidences for general intelligence, but one evidence against general intelligence is the existence of savants. Savants are people who have an extreme high level of ability in one or more specific areas, such as people who are super good at music but maybe not very good at communicating, folks who are incredibly wonderful at math but have trouble doing their taxes, people who can remember everything that they've ever read, but if you ask them to explain what a person is feeling by looking at their face, they would have no idea what you're talking about. Savant syndrome is having an exceptional ability in one specific area, and this video presents one such example of a wonderful person who is super good at music, even though they may have trouble in other areas. Go ahead and give that a watch, and we'll meet back here in 3, 2, 1. Okay, so people who have a lot of ability in one area but not so much in others seem to present evidence for multiple different types of intelligences. And indeed, the idea that multiple intelligences exists is a prevalent one in the literature and psychology. There are people who believe this. There are researchers who dedicate their lives to the researching of multiple intelligences, such as visuospatial, interpersonal, intrapersonal, emotional intelligence, communication intelligence, naturalistic intelligence, body intelligence. There's so many different possible intelligences that people can have, and realistically, it makes sense to me that everyone can have different levels of intelligence. For example, if you you work at a lawyer's office, it makes sense that you would have a lot of legal intelligence or maybe logical intelligence because you have experience with it and because you're probably good at your job. But if you work in a farm, you might have a lot more naturalistic intelligence, again because of the experience, and again because, well, you're probably picked up that job because you might be good at it. Interestingly, though, research into multiple intelligences also provides evidence for the existence of a single overall intelligence. For example, people who are good at one thing tend to be pretty good at everything. To a simple, at least to some extent. So being good at one thing makes you more likely to be good at other things suggests that there are people who just have higher intelligence overall. Despite that, I would not want to downplay the value of either general intelligence or multiple intelligences. Everyone has their own value, and if you feel as though you don't have intelligence in things that you've been doing or in things that everyone else does, that doesn't mean you don't have value in and of yourself. I can promise you that for the most part, what matters in life is working really hard, not so much having this innate ability. However, we are talking about the chapter on intelligence, so let's get back to that. One of the most important types of intelligence in the world is emotional intelligence. Emotional intelligence is the ability to perceive, understand, manage, and use emotions to your benefit. For example, using emotions sounds kind of manipulative, but if you have high emotional intelligence, you could help yourself be peppy and motivated in the mornings when everyone is struggling, or you could work with your emotions when you're feeling depressed, so that you can learn and grow as a person. Um, One of the things about emotional intelligence is that everyone always benefits from people who have emotional intelligence. If you are in a workplace, no matter what workplace you work in, people with high emotional intelligence seem to do well because they bring everyone up. They help people feel happier, they understand what people are feeling and work with them on their level, and they help conversations go more smoothly. Excuse me. I hope that didn't get picked up. Anyway, when you have high emotional intelligence, people likely like you better, and you make other people's lives happier. As with all of the multiple types of intelligences, emotional intelligence is something people can learn through practice. So if you feel as though you often struggle with other people, maybe do your best to learn about how to be more emotionally intelligent. I promise there are many, many videos about it on YouTube and resources online. One example of being emotionally intelligent is having emotional maturity. What is emotional maturity? It can be hard to vocalize. Luckily, we've got a video here that's done a wonderful job in presenting it for us. Go ahead and give a watch to this video and come back in a moment when you've checked it out. 3, 2, 1. Okay, let's move on. We're going to take a look at intelligence testing. There are three types of intelligence tests presented here. First, just intelligence tests or assessments of mental abilities compared to others. That's something, the two important things there are that they're an assessment of your ability, and that an intelligence test score is always relative to another person. It's always compared to your age or the average of people in your country or your gender or whatever. Now, the idea of an intelligence may not be too complicated, but the reason it's presented here is to contrast it with an achievement test. An achievement test is an assessment of what a person has learned. So, in this class, we are really not testing intelligence when you take a test. We are testing achievement. When you take a test of something you've learned, you're really not checking whether you're intelligent or not. So if you do well in this class or if you do poorly in this class, I hope you do not feel that that reflects on how smart you are. Instead, it reflects on how willing you were to work towards learning the material in the class. Finally, an aptitude test is an assessment designed to predict a person's future performance or capacity to learn. Basically, an aptitude test checks how likely is it that you're going to do great in different areas. When you took the SAT or the ACT to get into college, you probably took an aptitude test that is intended to identify how well you would probably do in college. When you enter the military, they make you take these tests that help identify where you probably are best fit for. There are many different types of aptitude tests, and we won't really talk about them too extensively, but you can think of an aptitude test pretty much the same as the Hogwarts test, the sorting hat examination, where people get identified as being best fit in one or another different house of Hogwarts. It identifies where your talents and personality best suit you to be. Okay, so let's take a look at the results of different intelligence tests. We'll start with IQ, intelligence quotient, probably the most common or laypersonly understood result of an intelligence test. The intelligence quotient is a number that indicates your level of general intelligence compared to other people of your age group. So if you have an IQ of 100, you are said to be exactly normal for your age group. Now, IQ is something that a lot of people talk about and point to. A lot of people feel as though it's important to have a high IQ, yada yada yada. That's nonsense. Actually, IQ is an outdated measure that used to be beneficial, but that people have figured out is not a good way to identify people's intelligence for quite a few different reasons, but probably the biggest and most obvious reason is that if you have a good or normal intelligence for people of your age group, that's a fine and dandy description for children and adolescents that are still developing. But, once you hit like 30, when your brain is really not developing with age, people from like 30 to 60 wouldn't have an IQ that differentiates very much based off of their age. So this metric is not the best. That being said, it does a wonderful job of presenting the idea that you're going to always compare your intelligence to other people. So that 100 is colloquially known as normal for who you are. Lower than that is known as less intelligent. Higher than that is known as more intelligent. But it's important to know that the vast majority of people are going to fall within a certain range. You are normally considered to be normal if you fall between an IQ score of 70 or 130. If you have learned anything about statistics, these represent about 2 standard deviations. What does that mean? Well, 95% of people are between 70 and 130 on the IQ scale. So that's going to be pretty much everybody. There's a GIF or there's a part in Forrest Gump where they explain that Forrest Gump is just below what is considered normal intelligence, and so he wasn't allowed into a normal school, except that he was allowed into a normal school. It's a wonderful movie, and I would really encourage you to not think about intelligence as something that's as important as being hardworking. And I can absolutely assure you that Forrest Gump is an incredibly hardworking man. One last point here. Intelligence is really not something that changes a whole lot over the course of your lifespan. There are many games, programs, classes that say that they can increase your IQ. That's kind of nonsense. That has more to do with your biology than much of anything else. So being properly raised and having good nutrition and stuff like that has more to do with your IQ than anything else. So it's not like as if it's something you should have pride in or something you should feel shameful about. There's nothing you can do about it, just like there's nothing you can do about how tall you are. A better way to measure intelligence, a much more modern way to measure intelligence, is the WAIS, the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale. This test consists of, I think it's like 16 different subsections grouped up into 4 different parts. The questions in the WAIS all have aspects of general intelligence to them, but they test that general intelligence in different ways, and you can totally do well in a bunch of sections and poorly in different sections and still be considered average, high, or low intelligence. What sections are there? Well, broadly, the sections include similarity sections where you're asked, how are these two things alike? And so the simplest questions involve concrete words like how are wool and cotton alike? Of course, they're both fuzzy, they're used to make clothing, they both come from plants, they're both white. Sorry, wool does not come from plants. Doy, you can tell I'm a little bit tired there. But they both come from living beings. There's lots of ways that they can be similar. But then you get into more and more complicated questions like how is justice and freedom similar? Of course, you probably could figure something like that out. The answer, they are American values, is not acceptable, and you have to really describe how the two concepts are similar. So you can see how that gets harder and harder. Vocabulary questions are just straight questions associated with the knowledge or understanding of words. You just define them. A lot of times these vocabulary tests are the most learnable part of the intelligence scale. And I can tell you that increasing your vocabulary is supposed to be able to increase your intelligence. That has something to do with having a better ability to explain yourself. Is a clear indicator of intelligence. Maybe not so much because it makes you smarter, but because you're just better able to convey the intelligence that you already have. Next up, memories and sequence type tests. Makes sense that memory would be a part of general intelligence, but sequences can be a little bit difficult to understand. They are also tend to be memory type tests. An example of a sequence is there on the bottom. What you need to do is repeat the letters and numbers in their correct order, and so you might be given the sequence R2CM1M3. Sorry, R2C1M3, and then you have to say CMR123. That's pretty hard for me to do. I don't think I did very well on that part of the test whenever I took it. Finally, block design, and these are the kinds of questions you might most commonly associate with intelligence test. They look something like this. Which of these pieces go together to complete this puzzle? And you're giving these 6 different things, and you have to choose 3 of them, and it's really easy to do this, but the speed at which you can complete the test has more to do with your intelligence than whether or not you're able to figure out the answer, because presumably you could just draw it out, right, with a pencil. Okay, so there's your description of the WAIS intelligence test. It's kind of a grueling test. It takes quite a while to administer, and people who have the experience to administer the test are kind of few and far between. Folks learn that in their psych masters, and just about every semester at MSU there are people who need to practice taking their WAIS test. So if you want to get tested for free, you can get an unofficial test done to you if you see if you figure out whoever's teaching the scales class at MSU and email them and say, hey, I'd like to be a test subject. I'm sure there are people who are more than willing to practice on you because they have to practice to pass their classes. Anyway, back to the PowerPoint. Let's talk about reliability and validity. Gosh, what the heck is that? Well, when you're examining people, when you're testing people for abilities, you need to make sure that your tests are good. How can you tell if a test is good? Well, through the 2 measures of reliability and validity. Reliability is the extent to which a test has a consistent outcome. If you test someone for intelligence, you want their intelligence to roughly come up as about the same every time they take the test. That's why if you have an intelligence test that's just like one of those silly riddles, it's not a very good test of your intelligence. You ever heard one of those intelligence tests like, a red house has red bricks and a blue house has blue bricks. What is a greenhouse made out of? The answer is supposed to be glass because it's a greenhouse for plants, but it's easy to get people to trick people and get them to say green bricks. Even though technically in that situation both answers are acceptable due to the fact that the answer is ambiguous. But it makes sense that a test of intelligence needs to consistently give you the same result. So that's what reliability is. Validity is the extent to which a test gives you a result that actually measures what you're trying to measure. So if a test, you can say that a test gives you the same answer over and over again, but doesn't actually do a good job of testing people's intelligence. Here's another example. Remember when we learned about the horse who could do math? He was being tested reliably. Every time he was asked a math question, he would answer correctly. It makes sense that most people would identify him as someone who could do math. It was a reliable test. Ask him to do a math question, have his trainer ask him, da-da-da-da-da. However, having his trainer ask him math questions was apparently not a valid test of the horse's ability to do math, because when a different person asked him math questions, the horse was unable to answer. So what was going on is that the test was not a very good test of the horse's intelligence or ability to do math. Instead, what was being tested is the horse's ability to pay attention to his owner and figure out what he's supposed to do based on those context clues. Does the idea of reliability and validity make sense? it can be something that's confusing to people. So I've got one more example here. The reliability of a test has to do with how consistently it gives you a result. So if you're playing with a bow and arrow, the first result here is reliable but not valid. It's reliable because the bow gets shot in the same place pretty much every time, but it's not very valid because the accuracy is not where you want it to be. You want it to be down here at the bullseye. Next up, we have a result of a low validity and low reliability test. The arrow gets shot almost randomly across the target, so it doesn't have very much reliability. And by looking at this example, we can tell that without reliability, you cannot have validity. There's no way to be on target if you are not very consistent with your shots. Next up, we have a result that says not reliable and not valid. What does that mean? Well, the shots are consistently above where they need to be, so the person is aiming wrong. And also, they are not very consistent in exactly where they are, so they're not very reliable. Finally, we have a reliable and valid result. The person is on target and consistently on target, just like you'd want an intelligence test to consistently give you accurate intelligence results. Within validity, there are several different subsets. The first one is content validity. Validity for whether or not the something is measuring what it intends to measure. So in the horse thing, we were saying that the test of the horse's math ability might have been a better test of the horse's ability to pay attention. And so sorry if you can hear that. I am receiving multiple texts simultaneously. But a good example of this is when you buy juice and it says it has 100% juice, but it actually only contains 27% juice. What? It seems as though the identification 100% juice is not very content valid. Next up, we have predictive validity. Predictive validity is whether or not something does a good job of estimating or guessing something about someone else. This is usually tests that have a small, quick, simple version of the test that are supposed to be in place of a larger, more complicated test. For example, let's say that you are on a speed dating night at a bar, and you have 5 minutes to meet 10 people, so 5 minutes for each person. You probably want to come up with a conversation starter that has really good predictive validity for identifying whether the person is someone you want to talk to. So what sort of conversation starters would those be? You could ask them how their day went if you just care about whether they are able to hold a conversation, but you can kind of fake that. Maybe you ask them whether they believe in the same things you believe in, because that's a very important thing for you. These different packagings show examples of situations where the predictive validity of the packaging was falsified, like a marker box that seems to have a lot more markers than it actually does. It makes sense that the apparent hugeness of this marker box is limited by the fact that its predictive validity is really little. You don't actually have as many markers as it looks you have. Next up, the packaging of this gummy bear set has gummy bears all over the top and on the side, so it looks like it's totally full of gummy bears when in actuality it doesn't have that many. Finally, this pizza, which seems to be a pepperoni pizza through and through, is actually only having 3 pepperonis. A way to cheat the system, so it looks as though you're getting a pepperoni pizza when you're actually just getting a sad pizza. Okay, so we just covered 2 different types of validity. There are quite a few different types of validity, but for now we're going to move on to look at another aspect of intelligence, stereotype threat. What is stereotype threat? Stereotype threat is a situation where a person's intelligence is impaired by the fear that they might think other people think they're dumb. What does that mean? Gosh, well, imagine you are a woman scientist and you are in an area that is dominated by men, such as engineering or mathematics. People who are in those situations might be afraid that they would be considered stupid. In your fear, you feel anxiety, you feel concern, you work really hard and don't sleep very much, and because of all those things, you end up doing poorly on your exams, or you end up doing poorly when you're talking to your friends, or you just generally end up looking stupid because you're so scared about looking dumb that you end up looking dumb. That is stereotype threat. It's a very real problem in so many scenarios. Originally, when stereotype threat was investigated, it had to do with African Americans in school systems. There weren't there was this common stereotype that African American people may not be as intelligent as other people, which we know obviously is completely totally wrong, but because of racism, it was a prevailing threat, and so African American people uh, may experience anxiety from the possibility that they may be seen as stupid, and that anxiety led them to uh, not do as well in school as they might alternatively do. It's a tough subject to deal with, but it makes sense that if you're so anxious about looking smart, you might not actually look smart because you're preoccupied with your anxiety. This video does a wonderful job of presenting the idea and explaining scenarios where it might arise. So I'd like you to pause my video and go ahead and watch this one. I'll give you to the count of three. 3, 2, 1. Okay, so I think the last section here is going to look at people with intellectual disabilities. And an intellectual disability is the best phrasing that we currently have for folks whose mental ability is below the 95% mark on intelligence. Now, remember what we spoke about during the sex chapter. In psychology, we do not identify things as problematic unless they are problematic. You generally do not have a disability unless you are unable to perform life's daily functions. So you may have a situation where you have low intelligence, but your intelligence does not impair you to live with the demands of everyday life. There's a video here, sorry, and a link here to an interesting question. Would Forrest Gump be allowed to serve in the military? Forrest Gump, as you probably know, is a character from the movie Forrest Gump who is supposed to be just slightly under the acceptable range for intelligence people. But he was a very, very successful person in his life. And part of the reason he was successful was because he was very hardworking, but he was also very dedicated. The Quora response to this question is really interesting. They point out a number of things that are aspects of intelligence that are required to be successful in the military that Forrest Gump clearly presents, such as not running away under extreme duress in a conflict military situation. So if you were interested in an example of someone who might not be intelligent but might actually be super intelligent depending on the circumstances or the way the information is assessed, go ahead and check out that Quora response. So what sorts of people, or what may be causes of low intelligence? One of those is Down syndrome. Down syndrome is a biological condition resulting from having an extra chromosome that causes intellectual and physical developmental differences or impairments in people who have Down syndrome. You may be familiar with folks who have Down syndrome. It was something that I was very familiar with from a young age because my school was kind of divided into three parts: folks who were deaf, folks who had learning disabilities in one way or another, and folks who were just regular students in the city. So part of our class curriculum was that we would always, I think once a month or so, meet with Buddy, one of the children in the in the intellectual disabilities part of the school, and we would work with them, play with them, teach them stuff, and really just get acquainted with people in these conditions. And so many of the people with Down syndrome are just wonderful, wonderful people. I've got a couple videos here presenting information about them. The first one here shows videos about a gentleman with Down syndrome who owned a restaurant, and it was one of the most positive restaurants of all time. There's a video here about a lady who worked in a McDonald's and eventually retired from a McDonald's and was very, very, very dearly loved. So there you go. These folks are just, they're some of the most interesting people that you could ever encounter, and I'd really encourage you to watch these videos, watch all of them if you can, just to get an idea of what folks with Down syndrome look like and what they can offer to the world. They tend to be incredibly friendly and loving, maybe a little bit naive, but who isn't naive here and there? And they tend to be very romantic, actually, and they actually tend to have high sex drives. And so they have most, if not all, of the exact same needs and wants that anyone else does have. They just are a little bit different. That doesn't mean that they're any better or worse off than folks. They might just need a little bit of help fitting into our society. And whenever I speak to a disability or a subset of people, it's always very important to me to give you a little bit of experience and knowledge in how to navigate the landscape of what could potentially be a rocky condition. So when we covered the sex chapter, we talked about person-first language, and as a follow-up to that, I've got a chart here from a very respectful organization that does a good job of explaining what a good language to use might be to avoid speaking disrespectfully to or about a person who has any sort of disability that you might talk about. So, of course, we have cognitive and learning disabilities here as well, but there are a lot of these more physical disabilities. The language that you may have heard or you may have been given or that you just use colloquially, as well as better ways to speak about things. Of course, this isn't something that you're required to learn. I know there are underlined bits here, but that's just part of the language, part of the chart there for you. Okay, and the last thing we've got here on the PowerPoint is the difference between longitudinal and cross-sectional studies. So, as you may have figured out by now, study is a word that we use in psychology to mean an experiment where you're investigating people. There are two ways to investigate how age affects people. One is a longitudinal study, where you take a look at one person or a set of people over a long period of time, often several years. An alternative to that is a cross-sectional study, where you take a look at a bunch of people at different ages to see how different people of different ages are doing. It makes sense that these different types of studies would have different values. For example, if you want to look at a cross-sectional study, you're going to have differences in people's ages, not just associated to whatever you're looking at, but also associated to whenever they were born and how they were raised. If you look at a longitudinal study, it's easier to single out specific things that you want to learn about, but it can take forever to learn about it because it literally runs as fast as normal time runs. When you're studying intelligence, people with disabilities, folks with Down syndrome, or really just about any of the things that we talked about here, longitudinal studies and cross-sectional studies can be incredibly beneficial. I haven't done any long-term longitudinal studies myself, but I have worked with folks who have, and I have worked with data from longitudinal studies associated with how people grow older. And I myself have done a fair number of cross-sectional studies where we looked at people of different ages and checked how their age affected their results. But alas, that is the end of the material for today. I hope you've had a wonderful time. I hope you learned quite a bit and thought the material was interesting. I'd like to thank you for paying attention for today, and I wish you a wonderful afternoon. Sayonara.